Evoke is all about linked conversations that come together to help us improve our food systems. This morning in plenary, we've discussed how to position ag for a new industrial revolution. Just here on this stage, in the previous panel session, we discussed how to bring more big capital into the sector. Tomorrow we'll be looking at biosecurity. But now we're going to dive into one of the key reasons that we want to get all these things right. Not just making money, although that would be nice if someone got a return somewhere along the way. We're looking at food security. Food security is important to every nation, it's important to the world. We are a surplus food exporter, but we shouldn't confuse that for medium-term food security. Anyone who doubts that, read up about the Irish famine of the 1940s. Food security is about more than just tech and capital. It's a whole system issue, and it's worth getting it right. Our next panel is going to tackle this from the ground up. Please welcome to the stage Michael Vukadinovich from Pavilion Farms, Beth Jones from Agricultural Victoria, Chris Souness from Wimmera Southern Mallee Development, Karen Kane, CEO, Advisor and Board Member, and your facilitator, Ben Van Delden of Delco Agri-Food. The floor is yours.
Is that sound coming through? It sounds like it is. We've got a good Kiwi echo coming through. Thanks everyone for choosing this session and allowing us to thread through from the capital conversation into this conversation around food security. As Tim says, we're going to really try and make this connect at a farm and regional level. And I'm going to start us off with sharing some perspectives from an in-flight piece of work that the RDC community is coming together around and funding to explore the role of system thinking in strengthening our agriculture and food industry, a piece of work that AgriFutures and GRDC are bringing to life. So just allow me to set the scene and then we'll get into the discussion with the wider panel. So food security is often framed in terms of how much food we produce, and recent shocks have exposed cracks in this traditional view. Australia grows, as Tim says, enough food to feed ourselves many times over. In fact, roughly enough food to feed 100 million people, yet we only have 28 million people here. So how is it that on occasions we still have situations where supermarket shelves are empty and there is a rising hunger across Australia? How is it that local councils now have food security officers in a nation that produces enough food for 100 million people? The paradox really highlights that food security isn't just about farm output, it's actually about how well our systems connect from paddock all the way through to plate. When one of those lines breaks, be it transport, be it labour, energy or policy, the whole chain can falter. During COVID, of course, we saw that. We saw plenty of food, perishable food, that was sitting at the farm stage of production that couldn't reach the consumers. Consumers faced shortages despite there being supply. In other words, Australia's food security today is less of a problem of agricultural yield and more of a problem of system fragility. Granted, we still need to make sure we have the right inputs to agriculture, that is for sure. So why is this? Well, it's because food security is an emergent property of what we call a complex system, one that spans agriculture, but also energy, also water, also transport, also finance, also health, and vibrant community networks. They all need to work in harmony to give us food security. These parts are deeply interdependent. Climate extremes can knock out roads, knock out power, disrupt harvests, and cold storage systems in regional towns, leaving crops unpicked. These pressures don't act in isolation. They compound and they amplify each other across the system, often in really unexpected ways. So a narrow or siloed fix in one area can even backfire. For example, when we're chasing efficiency in one link, just like real-time, just-in-time logistics or centralized processing, if we have a failure there, it removes buffers in our system, which can make the whole food system more brittle. So in short, optimizing individual components of the food chain without regard to that bigger picture can inadvertently weaken our overall resilience. So this is why a whole of system perspective is not optional, it's actually essential. It's why we need to step back and connect the dots from paddock through to plate. And the on-farm production and the input suppliers, as was mentioned in the previous panel, through to having robust and reliable processing and transport systems and retail distribution into the household. This means thinking beyond our traditional sector boundaries. Food security is not an agricultural issue or a welfare issue or an environmental issue. It's actually all of those, and how they interact is the critical challenge. So, we're here today to move from theory into practice, and this discussion about food security as a systems challenge is going to look at the demands that we think it demands that we think in terms of interlocking parts and feedback loops, not isolated fixes. So, over the next hour, this Brains Trust that is assembled on stage is going to open up a discussion about what are the real-world examples from regional communities all the way through to national policy. We'll ask how can we do a better job at linking efforts and finding leverage points that make the whole system stronger rather than chasing silver bullets. So my aim is that when we finish here today, we'll all leave with a clearer understanding of why we need to break out of those silos and take a collective national view of food security and all of the elements beside agriculture that contribute to that. And where are those opportunities for concrete action and productivity growth as well. So that's the setting for the conversation. I think to kick us off, we might start by asking each of the panelists, from your perspective, food security obviously can't be solved in isolation. It is a whole of system issue. And so what does system thinking for food security actually mean to you, and why does it matter? Maybe, Karen, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for being here today, and I hope this is a great session for everybody. Look, I want to start with some comments made at the opening this morning about place, practice and people and everyday decisions. And that's going to be the tenor of what I talk about. The question is, following up from Ben's question, how do we really understand the impact of interdependent conditions in a place, in a location, in reality, and the context for that particular place, because that really matters to this particular food security question in that area. And communities, food security sits within communities. And we need to understand those interdependencies around community as well. I want to give you a really practical example. Last year I spent 8 months working with a researcher out of RMIT, with the local council, in a small community, Nuji Niram, near West Gippsland, to really understand what food security looked like in terms of the practice that was already happening on the ground. Now, why was there an interest there? Because they're going through a transition, an industry transition around forestry, which was one of their key industries. So they wanted to really understand what their future could look like around food security and businesses, local businesses. So we had a discussion with them about what would help here to understand the total picture in this community around food security. And we undertook a really lengthy process of trying to actually understand what was happening on the ground. And so over that period of time, many conversations, from cafe conversations to conversations in the field, to group meetings on a regular basis. We were there every couple of weeks, spending all day. And so one of the things that's really important, people are very proud of what they do. But what we got down to was a whole range of things associated with a couple of really important interdependent factors. Economic, environmental and social were the leads. But the questions we were talking with them about and finding out about what they actually do every day, what their business was about, what their hopes for the future were, what they were working on, and looking on the ground about it actually, working, was around things like, well, what value add are you working on for the products you've currently got? And so that led us to trial, that led us to testing, research, undertaking their own research, either through industry research or independently, both national and international. Looking at new technologies for how they precision farm, understanding the transport situation in terms of their product getting to market, where their markets were, what sort of markets were they hoping for. And went everything from local markets through to national and international across these producers. Obviously led us to skills, because skilled workforce makes a big difference. And where were they getting their skilled workforce from? How is the local TAFE contributing to that? What are they doing about accommodation for seasonal workers? Training, on-the-job training. So we talked a lot about those really practical things. Storage, how do you store your product before it goes to market? Very important things. So collecting this information and testing that back to them. So recording and saying, is this accurate? So it was a two-way process to really, really understand what was actually happening. Environmentally, these producers were producing in a particular location that really mattered in terms of the products that they were producing, because they had to have right growing conditions. And so they had chosen to locate to this location for that particular reason. That really mattered to try and understand what that meant and why it was important. And it had implications for what they grew, water, you name it, and everything else that goes with the climate around a particular product. We talked about waste, we talked about soil, we talked about monitoring, and as I said, precision farming and how that monitoring system, that led us to things like, well, what about connectivity, both energy and telecommunications? And so they were solving those problems as well, quite an isolated end-of-line community. And minimal chemicals, they were looking to be very sustainable in terms of their practice, so talking about that. In terms of social, local identity matters. So this community were very proud of their past and their history, and wanted to maintain that sense of identity. So part of being confident about the future came into this discussion that we were having, and about ownership about their future. It was also about inclusiveness in terms of how other parts of that community were participating. So it might have been local cafes, it might have been markets that were local as well, and where the broader connection came to what they were producing. As we went down these rabbit holes, because that's what you start to do with systems work, you go deeper and deeper, and it starts to point out different things you need to pay attention to. So there were no assumptions here. This is about how you learn about what matters. So energy became a really important concept around cost of energy, but how renewable energy could actually have better environmental benefits. And the other part that connected, which starts to happen, is around tourism, because it's also a tourist area. So how do we ensure that we've got tourism happening here lined up with this? And everything from farm gate to artisan products as well that were being produced around this community. And hospitality, obviously. Two last points I want to make is around collective stewardship. They were organising to get to know their farms. So they were doing tours of their own farms to find out what everyone was doing, and have formed a governance arrangement now where they are working on a regular basis about what they can share. So in a practical term, when you've got particularly smaller producers, they're now sharing staff, they're now sharing transport, They're sharing equipment. They're learning about the practices. They're using waste collectively, but they know they've got to do more on that. So this concept of continuing to work on the systems that will benefit their business, but more importantly, the system around where these businesses operate is becoming really important. The other aspect we investigated was, the role of planning, what's getting in the way of what they can do in their business, legislation, all things to do with food production, and understanding that information, being able to deal with it. And what came out really important was the role of industry, national industry groups as research and sources of information. And producers starting to say, well, let's monitor our crops together so we can learn from each other. And so if we do that, we're all going to benefit. So this idea of collaboration and innovation is really, really taking shape. One of the things we did with that information was some system mapping, and that is one of the things that I think is really important for how we understand what the risks are and what the strengths are around how our system's operating. And one of the great things about being able to do this is to look at the multiplier effects. So if you have too many risks operating all at once, then you have the situation where the system, can break down quite significantly. So they were looking at those risks, they were looking at the strengths, and they were making sure that balance was being addressed. I think this is an opportunity for us to think about a systems mapping approach where we can really understand the interdependencies that occur, and I think this could be scaled up, doing some work at the moment Gippsland-wide around a program involving some cooperation with EU regions. It's a question that people are asking at the moment: how do we understand the whole system and how do we make the most out of food security, yes, but more broadly, agriculture is a key lead of economic development and the future of a region like Gippsland. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. That's a good example of a coordinated regional approach. And in a similar vein, Chris, when you think about food security and what it means in the role you play in the Wimmera.
Chris Saunis, I'm based in the Wimmera Southern Mallee region in Victoria. It's, as I say, it's a different system to Karen and different things. We're broad agriculture. We produce far more, so export commodity systems is what we have in play. So I think it's important to understand each system is different, but in the end, food security doesn't fail at the farm gate. It fails where the different systems interact. So if you think that if fertiliser is energy embodied, freight is infrastructure embodied, workforce is housing embodied, food processing and agricultural processing is energy and labour embodied, and then climate risk over the top amplifies all that. As soon as you change, and everyone thinks of their own system, as soon as you change one part of one system, it resonates across all others. So I think one of the challenges is how do we understand a decision someone makes in energy policy, how, for example, might play in, does this increase farm production volatility or decrease it? Does it stabilise the workforce or does it decrease the stability of the workforce? Does it strengthen the system resilience when it's under stress, or does it increase the stresses? And I think that's what system mapping and thinking about food security as a system, you have to think beyond just food security as a system. It's actually thinking of all the other systems in play and how they interact, which is hard work.
And we'll come back to when it doesn't work and what the consequences are on a community level as well. Beth, your perspective on food security and why it matters.
Thank you, and I think just, very much thinking with some of the reflection and the work we do in AgVic, I think increasingly it's realising that, ag today is far more than what happens in the paddock, and in an environment where the complexity on farmers and the farming system and farming being at the heart of the food production system, so I'm starting there, is increasing and some would say probably unprecedented. And, we think about the things facing that really dynamic context for that system in terms of biosecurity. The increasing profile of biosecurity that's impacting, and the sort of, trade and travel and global movements increasing all the time, really increasing that risk profile. We've talked about climate change and what that does in terms of the need for our systems to adapt to different climate norms and the impacts of natural disasters. And we've seen the impact of that this January in Victoria in terms of, really significant widespread fires across the state. All at the same time, where producers are navigating, input costs being high, fluctuating commodity prices, trade rules changing around the place. So pretty quick to see that, it's far more than what happens on the farm, and there are lots of things that are impacting that. And I think, farmers find themselves, and the production systems, agriculture is at the heart of this, finds itself in the middle of a lot of that. And you think about the fact that before someone's even produced food, the amount of input that has to go into that, whether it's diesel and fertiliser or land or labour or whatever it is, and then you think about the decisions that get made on farm in the processing of that, and then all of a sudden there's this massive, down supply chains down into transport systems and trade policy and international and national markets. Like, you just cannot look at that as one thing, and I think increasingly we need to think about that. I think for government, so agriculture, it is such an economic powerhouse in its own right, but it's such also an enabler of so many other industries. Touched on some of those before, but you think about, food manufacturing, transport, tourism, regional communities. We know for Victoria that so many of our local communities and economies are so dependent on agriculture, but agriculture is also such an enabler for them as well. So, can't really see it in any other way but as a system. And I think from a government point of view, there are plenty of systems and connections that sit across many of those complex interactions, but those complex interactions keep moving and changing, and we need to have a constant contemporary and modern way of thinking about how they interconnect, how they're changing. So it's not like we're starting at zero in any way, shape or form. Like, you think about the sector in Victoria, a $20 billion sector that punches above its weight nationally, produces 27% of all the food that gets exported overseas. It is a really strong and diverse sector with such a history of innovation and bouncing back and growing despite those challenges. But it's not something we can ever take for granted, and it's something that has to be protected, and it requires those sort of top-down, bottom-up, so the systems I'm talking about at a government level with the evidence base and the community conversation that Karen's been talking about are just so important for making sure that the ecosystem that sits around all that continues to work and allow the system to thrive for people in the economy.
I mean, there's so much to it as we're unpacking, as we go through this discussion. It's clear that food production is a team sport, and like all good teams, we need to have a good communicated team plan. And I think that's where the food strategy work needs to take us to as well, laying out those different elements at a regional context that we rely on to produce food. We need greater visibility of that. Michael, just turning to the original question around what does food security mean through the lens you look at this issue through as a producer, and both of food and now, of course, energy. How do you see this challenge playing out?
I'll answer that question in the context of why you've been kind enough to invite me here, Ben, and that is because we're broiler farmers, which means we grow meat birds for consumption, and we produce about 25 million birds a year at the moment. We're growing quite strongly. I was a son of a broiler farmer and then went off and did other things after a uni degree and came back to building our business 12 years ago. And food security in our industry right now is all around biosecurity, and especially avian influenza. And what your alliance, Ben, is looking at is trying to solve problems that are coming up in 5 and 10 years' time, and that's what has to happen. Policy doesn't always look at that. The areas around biosecurity, it's very reactive. rather than proactive, but it's something that really needs to be addressed. But more than that, 10 years ago, I decided that I wanted to do something. I always had an ambition to have a circular farming system, and that means that we use all of our waste from our farms, both being off the land. So when we cut wheat, we have straw left over that we have to deal with. And then from our own broiler farms and production farms, we have a lot of chicken manure. So circularity was always that aspiration for me. And that meant that, in my case, it was going down the path of building a biogas plant that uses broiler manure as a feedstock. Off I went to Europe in 2016 thinking I'll just order one and off we go. Well, I found out that you can't do it. And the reason is that broiler manure has got about a 4.5% nitrogen in it. When the nitrogen goes into the AD system, it turns into ammonia, and that basically kills the bugs that are doing all the work to generate the biogas. So it was a non-starter, and I sort of said, well, I'll keep going at this. And a few weeks ago, I sat down in a chair in my office and thought, if I knew all the walls that we had to jump over to get here, would I have done it? The answer was definitely no, because it's been a hell of a journey. But we have just commissioned the world's first biogas plant that uses broiler manure as its primary feedstock. So what I mean by that, we're feeding 85 to 90% of our feedstock comes from our broiler manure. We produce 40,000 tonnes of it a year. And common, or up until now, the highest loading of broiler manure is about 30% in an AD plant. Why is that a food security issue 10 years ago? I won't say that I was able to foresee it, but it's certainly one of my first businesses was as a 13-year-old selling chicken shit from the old man's farm. And so I've been around it for a very long time. I'm 59, so I'm ancient. And one of the things you understand about it is that it is actually a waste. And at the end of the day, it's got high emissions of methane, it's got high emission, and that's why we're able to produce methane from it once we got over the issue of ammonia inhibition. It's got high emissions of nitrates, it's got high emissions of nitrous oxides. And once you understand that and you look forward to where the world is, and our biggest problem is a license to operate. So across Europe, there is a lot of areas now where they are banning the spreading of broiler manure to land. If you go to the Wye River area in the UK, there's a processor there that processes around about 70 million birds a year. They have banned them from spreading their broiler manure in that region because of the nitrification of the Wye River. And EPAs and clean energy regulators in the world are realising this now. And, you know, in a few years' time, 5, 3, whatever it is, Australia's going to have 1 million tonnes a year problem of classified waste. That means, from a food security issue, that doesn't mean that we can't continue to operate, but the cost of that food to our end consumer is going to go up a lot because we have to deal with the consequences not only of disposing of the classified waste, but also the very important environmental issues that come with that, environmental taxes that will come down the stream. So what we set out to achieve is that we can turn that around into an actual positive and think about how we can make that less of a cost burden on us, because the cost burden is it already is a significant cost burden, but it's going to increase significantly once it becomes a classified waste. So we take our broiler manure, we put it in our biogas plants, and we turn that into 3.5 megawatts an hour of power, which our farms only use 15% of that to sustain our birds. The rest is exported to customers. We produce about 4 megawatts an hour of power. 4 megawatts an hour of heat, which is basically harnessing the heat of the exhausts of the generators, which is about 460 degrees. The waste digestate that we get out the back end of our system, because we're the first biogas system to use a fertiliser product, the waste is actually valuable. And it's not something that we we have to dispose of. Digestate in itself in Europe is becoming a classified waste. Everything is becoming a classified waste, and that puts a burden on the environment and how you deal with it, and really it increases the cost of food to the end party, which is the people of the planet that have to feed themselves. So we use the heat that comes off the generators to process that waste into totally organic, 100% carbon-free fertiliser. So one of the what made us act was, from a food security issue, was our licence to operate was going to become more and more difficult and hell of a lot more costly.
So here we've got a situation where you were looking at this a decade ago around the pressures impacting the poultry production system, and you've navigated a path through to actually find product streams for the waste streams in your system. In doing so, you're addressing renewable energy, you're addressing a decarbonisation of a food product, and really importantly, you're also producing a domestic fertiliser industry as well. Now, at the core of that is understanding the material flows that are flowing through your business, but also I think at a food security level, we've got to understand the material flows that are flowing through the food system in Australia, because then we can do proper regional planning. And I think that's a nice link back, Chris, to the work that you do around working with farmers to understand what some of those critical inputs are that we depend on to produce our bulk commodity crops, and reacting to Michael's story about being able to domestically produce inputs to a farming system. How does a food security strategy force us to connect these dots? Just for you.
Yep. Yeah, so I think it's pretty important because at the moment in our region, energy and food security or agriculture are seen as the state they're aiming for is coexistence, which is basically the bare minimum. We can tolerate each other, but we don't want to actually have to work together, but we will tolerate each other. And that's being played out in the newspapers and the politics that's occurring around the nation at the moment. But I think part of it is because it's not actually understood that in our region, and I can talk about our agricultural system, and they've had 20 years of, I'd say, record agricultural productivity growth. Land values have increased 800%, put 200% management on top of that, and you've got 1,000% value increase the farmers have gone through, which is transformation and productivity gain that's never occurred any other time in farming in the region. So they've done a lot of transformation, and that's through technology, thinking about labour intensity, but that has consequences if productivity is your key measure of success, because in agriculture, and this is occurring across the Western world, it generally means population decline. And then if you start thinking of resilient systems, if you start thinking about labour, you start thinking about housing, you start thinking about social infrastructure allow populations to thrive, such as health, education, roads, because we live in democracy, and I'm very happy that we do. Governments make decisions where voters live, and if you depopulate, your issues tend to fall down a list of where you're going to, because if you're trying to get re-elected, you want to invest where voters are, and so this leads to food security issues. Or farmers not feeling like food security is being taken seriously, which leads to, I think, a lot of the challenge of coexistence rather than thinking about actually if we work together, actually we could have an agri-energy industry rather than tolerating each other.
Yeah, it's really interesting you make the point about chasing productivity. As important as that is, if you chase it too hard and choose automation, then you remove workforce in the regions, and then when you remove workforce, the fragility of a region is really affected, right? At a health system level, at a schools and the fabric of community, which is why we're producing food in the first place. So maybe, Beth, back across to your lens at a government level, how do we look across these pressures? What's happening in terms of the way government gets its feedback loops around emerging new industries that might be moving into regions, and what their effect will be on food production? Here in Victoria, of course, we've got some potential rare earth and sand mining activity potentially coming into Gippsland. We've got data centres knocking on our door. That's all really exciting, but how do we stand back and ask ourselves the question, what's the effect on water for agriculture, which is here to provide food?
Yeah, and that's the big question, right? And I think it's so important, as Chris said, working together and finding ways beyond sort of loose coexistence is so critical. And I think those mechanisms do exist, and I think there's good work happening in different parts of the state. But I do think it's so important to continue to concentrate on things like the evidence base, as Karen said, and understanding issues and opportunities at place, and they are very different at place, and they are very different for sectors and communities, and it depends on the history they've had, and Karen can talk at length about that. So I think really understanding that is really, really critical. And using that, as I spoke a little bit before about, there are existing settings. Government, we spend a lot of time collaborating across government. Like I sit in the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action. So that group, I think quite deliberately, has been brought together to sort of sweat the issues around energy transition, the energy and renewable energy. It's got the resources department. So I'm very actively involved in a conversation at the moment with the head of Resources Victoria, who's busily on the ground in the Wimmera and other parts of Victoria, really looking at critical minerals and what is that opportunity, but what is the perspective of the farmer? And it's also, what is the perspective of the farmer at the end of that too, in terms of rehabilitation of land. And so I think and that department's also got water in it, it's got agriculture in it, it's got environment in it. So, we're very actively, trying to challenge ourselves and each other around what does coexistence mean beyond, just bearing each other, as Chris is saying, and how do you actually work out what that means in terms of true opportunity. Yes, there's trade-off in it. Yep, it's not all, but it's also, a lot of the times it's not also one or the other. It can be, we do have kilometres and hectares of land in Victoria where agriculture and renewable energy coexist. But it's different horses for different courses. So I think it's something that government's very much putting its mind to. And if you look at some of the priorities that government has committed to in Victoria, we've got its economic growth statement points to manufacturing and agriculture in particular as being one of 5 really key pillars of the economy, drivers of the economy now and moving forward. At the same time, government's got commitments around net zero and climate. So in a room, that same conversation around the board table that I sit at is, well, government's got different ambitions. How do I sit there as the Chief Executive for Agriculture Victoria, who's on about a sustainable and productive and prosperous ag sector, but also think about how that sector can also play a role in some of the broader economic objectives of government in terms of net zero ambitions, because of the role that plays in the economy. So, but I just do think it's about recognising that none of that sits still. So it's got to be, conversations and engagement on the ground. It's got to be really active, and that sort of top-down, bottom-up, I think, is really critical.
Yeah, nothing stands still in any of those systems, right? It's in constant transition, and therefore we need really robust communication flows and discussion points around, what's changing. If we're seeing new industry coming, fantastic, but what's the consequence of that? Michael, I want us to just come back to the innovation focus that you've had in your business, and you think about this national focus on food security. From your lens, how do we scale up more of the type of innovation that you're working on? How do we make that more of a regular feature of regional productivity as a key input of food and also a producer of energy and fertiliser?
From an innovation perspective, I think Australia is well behind in supporting innovation of this sort. Once you get to a system where we were very fortunate, we got a sizable grant from the Victorian government. But in terms of getting to the point where you've made a decision that you're the grant that we got from the Victorian government was substantial. It was about $9 million. It ended up being about 15% of our total project cost. But getting to that point where you're going to put up tens of millions of dollars, the support system in the R&D incentive scheme is very clumsy. Right? We clearly innovated a system, a process, and we're still sitting there waiting for a very small amount of money, but it's just clumsy as hell. So I think the R&D incentive scheme can certainly be looked at because it doesn't incentivise many people. Like, would I go and apply for an R&D incentive scheme next time knowing what I've done now? Probably not. The time it takes, the investment of people, the investment of resources, the stress that you get pissed off about just constantly asking for the same information and ticking the boxes. But the innovation R&D is one area I think that Australia needs to really improve in. The other area that's we're looking at international projects because we've got a technology now that's a world first. There is a lot more support in other jurisdictions from things like subsidies and grants. Having said that though, we're not in a position where we need grants. We've proven what we set out to prove commercially. How do we now roll that out? We've got big rollout plans, hopefully in Australia, but also, if not here, overseas. And the things that, there's a lot of government funding areas, bodies out there that are to do with decarbonisation. A lot of them are very focused on electrification.
Yeah.
Right? Great, that's a great area to be focused on. And a lot of them are focused on wind and solar, and they think that's it. But there are other avenues to electrification. Right? There's not one technology that Australia should be backing. And I think the other area that is missing in the piece is there are other areas that need to be decarbonised. Like if you take what's the biggest emitter in the world, one of them is fertiliser. Yep. And there's not enough support for those sorts of decarbonisation efforts. Everyone in Australia, in where there's pools of money that you can go and access, it's all about electrification. It's slowly changing, but I think that's an area for focus.
Excellent. It sounds like there's a lot of work to do at Evoke and beyond Evoke and trying to connect up and scale these solutions. As you say, you've invested in the innovation. It's now how do we make it accessible across the food production zones that we have in Australia. Our clock is counting against us, so I'm going to do my level best to just summarise what we've heard from the panel today. Karen, you really reminded us about system fragility and the complexity and the multiple actors that need to come together at a community level to have this conversation, whether it's about food production and the different activities on farm through to what's the workforce that we will need to use the technologies or support the industries that are coming into our regions, what's the consequence that has on housing and storage of food and crops that we're producing, through to crop planning and how do we make sure we understand the intention of production systems, the critical inputs that need to flow into that, the transport and logistics that connects to that. Beth, you talked about how important it is that government continues to have the right feedback loops coming from these different regions and connects across the different land use demands that are emerging and allowing us to make the choices around how do we prioritise allocation of critical resources, water or land, for example. And Chris, we very much heard from you that these trade-off choices are very real at a community level. We can produce large volumes of exportable commodities, but if we rush to technology as the only solution to that and don't try and address critical inputs like energy and fertiliser at a domestic level, we end up effectively gutting our regional communities. So it's a really delicate focus area. And Michael, you made it real for us that yes, we can. We have the solutions. They are available to us. The question is, how do we scale them? How do we get those lifted and adopted? And I think it's really interesting to close with that point. We're a net fertiliser importer. It's one of our fundamental vulnerabilities in our food security system. yet we have the capacity using technology to actually turn that around and become a net exporter.
One of the things that is a reality is the consumer and probably retailers of food see carbon neutral or protein as being totally unrealistic and unachievable. It's somewhere out there in the never. But our biogas plants actually generate on-farm credits or on-farm offsets that will offset the full carbon footprint of the birds we grow on a consumer's plate. So it's there, it's now, it's ready now, and it's not unachievable. And I think we just have to think aspirationally and say no is not an answer.
Yep. Yeah, and it ties back to some of the work that we've been doing around the opportunity of climate smart agriculture, presenting a $7 billion farm gate value opportunity, and that's excluding any of the carbon credits. So there's massive opportunities for bringing value back to regions.
Could I just pick up on something Michael said? I know we're over time, but Michael made the point about it's how we produce our food, not just food security. And I think if we are looking down the opportunity of a free trade agreement with the EU, I'm not sure, that it's not just about economics they'll be looking for. They'll be looking about how our food is being produced. And so we need to be ready for that. And I think consumers are starting to look more and more for that too.
Yep.
So I think that's another part of the puzzle here.
Yeah, good point, Karen.
We can give the market the first probably real. It's not one of these plastic foods that have all gone out of fashion now, thank God, but we can put carbon-free protein on the plate for a very affordable price today.
Excellent. So the solutions are within our reach. That's excellent. Team, thank you very much for your time. Please join me in thanking our panellists.